evening all.
My name is Meir Fachler, and I am your host this evening. And I was born, bred, and buttered in Letchworth. Tonight, we will embark on a journey called Jewish Letchworth. For some, a journey of discovery, and for others, a journey of memories and reminiscing. I am absolutely platzing with excitement to host this evening's Jerusalem launch and to host my amazing eldest brother, Yaki, the author of Jewish Letchworth, a microcosm of the communal Jewish experience, recently published by Valentine Mitchell. I also wish to give a massive welcome to our three very special guests who have agreed to share some personal memories about different aspects of Letchworth. First, my amazing Aunt Miriam, otherwise known as Mrs. Miriam Fachler-Litke, my dad's younger sister. Mrs. Louise Lader, who is not sitting where she... Oh, there she is. Hello, Louise. And to Dr. Aviva Zorenberg. Welcome. This evening is not just a book launch, but a celebration of a special community that came and went between the years of 1940 and 1971. On the way here, I was thinking that we have lived here in Baka for 33 years. That's 2 years longer than the lifespan of Jewish Letchworth. And yet, it was 31 years that shaped and changed people's lives and impacted upon generations of Jews all over the world. Yaki, take us through the genesis of the Letchworth community, and perhaps you can also answer the question posed on the flyer that we created. Why was the Letchworth Jewish community the only one of 20 pop-up communities that was predominantly Orthodox? Yaki, bevakasha.
Looking around at the number of people here this evening, I have to admit to being very disappointed. And the reason is that last month, a guy in Texas launched his book in his local bookshop. And he sat at his table in his local bookshop, and nobody turned up. Not a single person. Walking into the bookshop was a well-known blogger. He had Rahmanas on the guy. So he sat next to him, and he interviewed him, and he wrote about his book. And the blighter sold 20,000 books. You've spoiled that possibility for me. Welcome. This is such a kef, such a pleasure. I can't tell you. So Meir asked the obvious question: where did Letchworth suddenly spring from? Why? And why Punkt when it did? And why Punkt Letchworth? So the answer is, in the week up to the end of August 1939, big things were happening. There was the non-aggression pact, and then there was the invasion, and in the meantime, over 1 million kids from London are sent out into the country, sometimes with their schools, sometimes without their schools, and getting totally lost in somewhere in Eckveld in England. And all this is happening at the same time, and it's war. Now, no bombs fell on London for several months, but the fear of bombs was there from the first day. So Jewish families who could wanted to get out of the range of bombs that would definitely one day fall on Jewish London. Jewish London. If you draw this arc around Jewish London, you can pinpoint up to 20 communities, I call them pop-up communities, who popped up in order to absorb Jews who wanted to leave London because they were very worried. War is war, no joke. Why did Letchworth, of all the pop-ups, become a frum community? Mostly, not all, not everybody. Why Letchworth? What did Letchworth do that was different from all other pop-ups? And the answer is 2 words. Abba Bornstein. Abba Bornstein, the oldest of the Bornstein brothers, the clan, was many things. He was the head of Mizrahi, so he was a real die-in-the-wool macher, and he was also a property developer. And as fate would have it, as the war broke out, he had just built an estate called the A-Born Estate. A. Bornstein, very creative. 2 streets, Hallmead and Mulway, and it was 1939 was the end of a depression in the British economy. And so 2 streets, which is 300 homes, 3 up, 2 down, lay empty in Letchworth as the war breaks out. You couldn't make this up. Abba Bornstein, he says to his mates, to his family, cousins, brothers, friends, fellow machers, and he even extended the invitation to N16 to Stamford Hill. He said, listen, welcome, you pay me rent, I'll give you a home. And they came in droves, very quickly. Now again, no bombs had fallen yet, but the fear drove hundreds of Jewish families to Hallmead and Mulway very quickly. During the war, there were still people who would come from London because they were bombed out, and so they just doubled up in these tiny little homes. And that is why, of all the kehilot around London, Punt, Letchworth, is the one that was predominantly, not entirely, but predominantly religious. Another reason why Letchworth was different in terms of the religious community is because when real bombs started falling on real homes, such as the Sassoon home in Mayfair, they had to leave. Where are we going to go? They asked their very good friend, and I think Shtickl Mishpocha, Mr. Lunzer. And they said, and he said, Letchworth. He already had a home there. Not with the hoi polloi, not with us lot. He had a home. No. And he said, why don't you come to Letchworth? And so one day in 1940, the entire Sassoon ecosystem landed in Letchworth with Mr. Peters, the cat, if I'm not mistaken. And they took up residence in Sollershot East, which is on the right side of the rail tracks. We were on the wrong side of the rail tracks. And so with this very strong Orthodox family with like I say, an ecosystem, plus dozens of rabbis who arrived in Letchworth in 1939 and 1940. And the rabbis and the machers very quickly built an infrastructure, a communal infrastructure that didn't belong in such a small place, but they did it. And so you had shuls popping up everywhere, Talmud Torah everywhere. They built a mikveh. They didn't build a cemetery. If you died, you had to be buried in London. And in fact, they didn't build anything. Everything was hired, which is why the Letchworth Jewish community left no physical footprint, which is why the present guardians of the heritage of Letchworth knew absolutely nothing about the Jewish community that was there during the war and after the war. Nothing. And so they've told me that I've given them filled a huge gap in local history. So this is the background. People flock. There are crazy amount of people in some of these homes, like mamash, very unsanitary, I'm sure, but a very thriving community. Now you've all heard of this story of the Jew who gets stuck on he gets marooned on a desert island and spends a few years there, and he's rescued. And the rescuers notice straight away he's built 2 shuls. They said to him, "What? Why one shul? Why have you built 2 shuls?" You all know the story. And he said, "Because in that one I never stepped foot." That's what happened in Letchworth. In the Frum community, with rabbis and dayanim and learned and machers and sort of all the ingredients of a really strong Frum community, it split straight away into 2 different communities. I live in Ireland. And Ireland has been independent for 100 years from Britain. You might know this. And yet, when it's convenient, everyone forgets that. So for example, if you are Irish and you want to go to university in Britain, you go through the British system of university application. It's as if you are British, even though you are not. And everyone turns a blind eye. So what happened in Letchworth was there was a lot of cooperation between the 2 kehillas, and eventually, of course, around about 1943, they merged, which was great for a year, and then people started going back to home. So that is why Letchworth got started. Very strong at first. During the war years, amazing. The end of the war, these are Londoners. Most of them are Londoners. They want to go home. And most of their homes were still there. And so 44, 45 people start going home. Most of the Kehillah went home to London. That is the wartime community. What's left is what I call the rump of the community. Probably about 100, 120 souls who stayed. And I was born at the beginning of the rump. My mum had the bump and I was the rump. And so I grew up literally with this rump of the community that had been. And I still met people who had lived in Letchworth. I knew who was who. And this went on until 1958. This is the end of the 2nd period of Letchworth. And in 1958, most of the rump went back to London, leaving the rump of the rump. Meir and I are the people who stayed on with the rump of the rump till 1971, when it all came to an end.
Thank you, Yaki, for the introduction to how Letchworth came about. I would like to ask my amazing Aunt Miriam Fachler, who landed up in Letchworth towards the end of the war, to share some brief memories of that period of time. I just want to say what an incredible zchut it is that we have our Aunt Miriam here with us. And it's amazing, you're only 53 and yet here you are, and you were around in the 40s. Amazing.
Good evening, everybody. I know that Meir, when he called me a couple of, it's okay, you can hear me? Yeah. When he called me a couple of days ago, he said, you have 5 minutes, which reminded me of my dear brother Eli at the time of Sheva Brachot for Gedalia, my younger son, and Ahuva, in a friend's house, the famous Wolfsons. And he was given 3 minutes by the host, and he talked for at least 3, if not more minutes, about the 3 minutes that he was given, and then he began his talk. So I don't know if I'll stick to 5 minutes, but I'll do what I can. Mine is a totally different story. How I came about to get to Letchworth. My background perhaps is more personal. Is more personal than perhaps you will hear otherwise. I was on the Kindertransport from Berlin and Lodz in August 1939 toward just before the war broke out. I was brought to Willesden Lane Grammar School together with a whole group of refugee children. And the first Shabbat we were there, I was told to sign for school. We were going to be evacuated on Sunday. War broke out, as we know, on the Sunday. And I had a very difficult, hard time. Up till then, my parents said, we'll see you again soon. But this is Friday night, and they're asking me to sign. And I wasn't going to do this. But it's an emergency, and you must. And truthfully, I do not remember. I have thankfully blocked it out, whether I signed or not on Shabbat. But I was taken to Hemel Hempstead with Willesden Lane Grammar School, with a whole group of refugee children and local Cockney children to Hemel Hempstead on that Sunday morning. We were taken to a big hall, like an ulam, and local people who had volunteered to host us, to take us in for however long it would take. I'm sure nobody thought it would take 5 years. And take us home with them and take care of them, take care of us. I like to call it pick a kid, because if you liked the way the child looked, you said, come with me. And this is basically what happened to me and another little girl. Luckily, we were both picked together, both little blondish and so on, to a family named Overhead. We were to call them Auntie Alice and Uncle Bert. English we didn't know much. I had learned a few words already in school. We were not allowed to speak German. So we were happy to have each other. At least we could whisper to each other in the language that we both understood. It obviously didn't take very long to pick up the language. We had a cheder nearby in Boxmoor. I think it was walking distance, a young rabbi named Rabbi Winter. And we also made Pesach that year right in Hemel Hempstead. No, that Pesach I went back to Willesden Lane Hostel. There was also each Pesach presented different problems, but the Pesach that I had turned 15 in 1942, I was invited to go. My brother was already in Buckingham, kibbutz, and I went to join him there for Pesach. Now, I just want to emphasize that although the people were very good to us and very kind and tried to be understanding, the war really took much too long. To have children come into your home and stay there. I had nowhere to go. I did not know about other children in Jewish hospitals with Jewish kids. I never heard of the name Rabbi Schoenfeld until way years after the war, when I didn't even live in England anymore. So it was something ein braya. There were no choices. I had to stay where I was because I had nowhere to go, and certainly had no funds to take me anywhere. So that was the situation. So coming to kibbutz Buckingham, I thought, oh, I'm going to be finally with my brother. It took 2 years before we could see each other anyway, and that was great. I loved it there. However, they did not allow me to stay because I was too young. I said, I'm too young, I'll get older here. But no, it was against the rules, and back I had to go to Hemel Hempstead and to my Gentile family. I'm going to skip a lot of the things and go fast forward 5 years later from the end of the war, Hanukkah 1944, when my brother married my dear sister-in-law Chava, the parents of my lovely nephews here, and I went to the wedding in kibbutz Buckingham. It was wonderful. I had a wonderful time, and and there was also my sister-in-law's sister Marion, and right away they invited me to come for a Shabbat. I said, wonderful, it's finally something is going to happen. Things are going to change. I went back home to Hemel Hempstead, and my dear Auntie Alice had changed. She had changed, she had become moody, and I was very, very unhappy. And I told her that I'm invited to go for the weekend and I want to go. She said, if you go, you will not come back. Those words were to me like a voice from heaven, not to come back, just to go and not come back. However, there was also a lot of trauma connected to it, and fright. I was very scared. What would I do? I went for the weekend. It so happened that I had to take 3 buses from Hemel Hempstead to Letchworth, because they lived in Letchworth. The family of my sister-in-law, the Beckers, lived in Letchworth, and that's where I was going. My first change of buses was at Hitching, and somebody called my name. I looked up, and there's Marion calling my name. She saw me standing at the bus stop, crying, and I went and joined her on the top of the bus. Meanwhile, the buzz bombs were buzzing, and when they were buzzing, we were fine, but if they stopped buzzing, it was not such a good idea because they would drop and bomb people. This was the first Shabbat, the proper Shabbat that I knew in almost 5 years. As I said, it was quite traumatic, and they tell me later on that I didn't stop talking, and I thought my poor parents of Chava and Marion, had to put up with this girl, not being able to get over the excitement and the program. However, they did get over it, and apparently they approved of me, and they listened to their dear daughter Chava, and they kept me. I became the 3rd daughter in the Becker house, and they became mommy and daddy. I started to meet people, friends of the Beckers, friends in the community. I remember Rabbi Broch, and of course I met the Sassoons. All the names that you see in the book, I remember names. I'm not going to go through them now, but I remember names and people, and people were very, very kind. I sort of joined the young people who were there. I think it was a Torah Avodah group, not yet Bachat, and I sat there and I wanted to belong and I wanted to fit in, but it was very slow because I didn't quite know how. I had come from, I had 5, I call them lost 5 years, so to speak, of this kind of tzvira. And I didn't talk much. And then one day they said to me, talk to us. And I was shaking, I was overcome with emotion, but talk I did. And that was a very good catharsis for me. I began to integrate and feel comfortable. I was working in London, as was Marion, and we roomed together in a little rented room in London. We became very, very close friends. And for Shabbat, we'd go home to Letchworth. So this was fine. So that Shabbat in Letchworth was always understood that we were going to be there. And I resumed in this way my new old life. I will give you a little side story. We had a 50th anniversary of the Kindertransport in London in 1989. I was interviewed by the BBC, and the interviewer asked me, how did you manage to retain your religion after all the years that you were away from it? How did you manage to do that? And I said to her, it was like a warm, comfortable blanket that had been returned to me, and that's how I felt. It was cozy, it was comfortable, and I was very happy to have it. Altogether, I was in Letchworth, I think, about 2.5 years, because in 1944, Hanukkah time, I became engaged to my husband, Rabbi Joel Litke. And then engagement took place in London in the home of Rav Gorovitz, Tante Libbe, as we know her, the oldest daughter of Rav Elia Lopian. Earlier that year, my good friend Marion was married to Rav Elia Lopian's younger son, Yankel. And through that, I became acquainted with the family. And I must say, I think they just reached out to me. I was invited to them all over the place. I had one Shabbos with Benzel and Loppy. Where was it? I don't know. Sheffield? Where was I? I don't remember. But anyway, this is the kind of thing that happened to me. The Lopians were wonderful. They still are. Right? In February 1948, I was married to my dear husband, Joel, and I will tell you that I borrowed a wedding dress from Flora Sassoon Feuchtwanger. Her wedding dress I wore to my wedding. Changed a little bit, but no, never a mess, that's what it was. My husband did not want to stay in England. He had come from Canada, courtesy of the British government, as an enemy alien, a young yeshiva bocher who was interned on the Isle of Man and shipped out to Canada. He stayed in Canada. Rabbi Price from Toronto got the boys out of New Brunswick, of the tree chopping camps, and together with the Nazis, and he took them into his yeshiva. He attended University of Toronto, he graduated, he got smicha, and he said, it's time to visit my brother and sister, who had also come on the Kindertransport to England. It was 7 years since they hadn't seen each other. Her brother was connected with Rav Schneider Yeshiva, as was my husband. That's how he got to England in the first place, from Frankfurt. And he came to visit his brother and sister. Well, there was some concoction going on which I didn't know about, and the upshot was that we got married in 1948, in February, and my husband did not want to stay in England. He looked for opportunities for jobs, but England, 3 years after winning the war, was poor. And his famous words were, "There's nothing to eat here." And if you know your Uncle Joel, he was not a big eater. So it was interesting. He preceded me to Canada. He secured a rabbinical position in a synagogue just outside of Toronto, and I followed him a few months later. I'm going to go fast forward, 1959, almost finished. 1959, we finally managed to get back to England to see the family. P.S. I should tell you that in 1947, both my brother, my husband's brother, my husband's sister, they were all married. Some of them had babies already, some not. They were all going to follow us to Canada. Nobody was going to stay in England. P.P.S. Nobody came. They all stayed in England. So this was for us difficult because we made a life for ourselves, but we were lonely. We had no family all those years, and that was hard. Our first trip was in 1959 with our 3 children. Our youngest, Gedalia, had his first birthday at Solarshot East in Letchworth. He also had his 10th or 11th birthday at the wedding of Shimmy and Malka Pine in Manchester. And his birthday is today and tomorrow, the 24th of July, and Zion Av. So I'm really happy I told you that. Now we were in Somerset East. It's no longer Hall Mead. Hall Mead, they took me in. They had an upper part of a small house, and we managed. We managed. I don't remember feeling cramped. Maybe I made them feel cramped, but I don't think so. And it was beautiful summer. We spent the whole summer on Solarshot, and we were invited many times to the Sassoons, and Rabbi Sassoon showed my husband the famous codex. So that's another claim to fame. And my 2 older children are sent to school with their cousins. They never forgave me. Ad hayom. If you talk about it today, who wants to go to an English school when you come from Detroit, from yeshivas? However, we were all close-knit and caring. There's one special chapter in the book about the Kiddush, the Shabbos Kiddush. Well, you can all read the book, but it was phenomenal. My picture, I have a very, very clear picture of the Kiddush and the guests and the students from Cambridge and the neighbors and whoever else came, maybe some Flotsam and Jetsam, I should say that. And the children, the Fachler children, I think they grabbed what they could get a hold of. It wasn't, didn't have much of a chance. Did you have cheesecake? Never got it. Okay. And I remember Susie sitting on Uncle Eli's lap. Very, very, very clear picture. So I have all these wonderful, wonderful memories, which I am happy to share with you. It was great Auntie Chava's meals and her fresh vegetables from the garden. It was the most happy time. And we went back several times after that, before 1975. And in 1976, '69, we watched from the lounge on Somerset East the moonwalk. That's very important. Yeah. So I just want to finish there. I thought in 1959 it would last forever. I wanted it to last. I needed it to last. But we know nothing is forever. But thanks to all of you who came, who lived in Letchworth, and who came here tonight, at least we can talk about it and we can celebrate and enjoy the good memories. And thank you, my dear Chava from Gan Eden.
No, it's 2.5. Wow, Auntie Miriam, never heard such a fast 3 minutes. Wow. So, thank you so much. So the war ended and many of the Letchworth residents, as we heard, began to move back to London. And the next chapter in the Jewish Letchworth journey is from 1945 to 1958. Now, why 1958? Because 3 things happened. Number 1, the Bornsteins finally moved back to London. Number 2, I was born. Number 3, 6 months later, we moved from Holmead to Sollershot, otherwise known as Snoddershot, east, as it is fondly known to, and just down the road, literally a few houses down, from the Sassoon household. Yaki, please describe to everybody this 13-year period and the gradual transition of the centre of gravity of Jewish life from the Aborn estate across the tracks to the other side of Letchworth to the Sassoon orbit. In so doing, please relate to something which Auntie Miriam just mentioned before, the second question we asked in the flyer, which is, how did the 1,100-year-old Codex Sassoon Hebrew Bible that recently broke the world record at Sotheby's come to spend 30 years in Letchworth? Yaki, bevakasha.
Hunter. Amazing as always, thank you. So, I mentioned that one of the reasons that the Letchworth Jewish community was proportionately more orthodox than any of the other pop-up communities around London is because of this, I call it the Sassoon ecosystem. Because the Sassoons had, there was the family, and there were people associated with the family, and it was a whole ecosystem in its own right. Once the main group of people left, we're talking now 1945, 1946, the Sassoons are not yet the dominant entity that they became in terms of the wider community, but straight after the war, Rabbi Sassoon, from his own pocket, starts bringing kids from about 10-mile radius by taxi twice a week to Cheder. Now, if someone turns up on your doorstep and says, you know, I'll send a taxi to bring your kids to Cheder twice a week. Yeah, come along. And so the Cheder became vibrant from that period and continued being vibrant right until the near the end of the 60s. Now, the Sassoon, I say that, you know, they lived in splendid isolation in Sollershot East long before we arrived there, but not so splendid isolated that when the Chief Rabbi Hertz, came on an official visit over Shabbos over Shabbat to Letchworth. He stayed, of course, at the Sassoon home. Those 12 years, end of the war to 58, the dominant families became Abba Bornstein's two brothers, Sally Shlomo Bornstein and Moshe Bornstein, who had their own uniform factory, a factory that made uniforms, close by, a place called Weston. It had been converted, of course, to military uniforms during the war, and afterwards went back to, I think, just doing suits. Those brothers were the unofficial leaders of the community. They decided who would be the president. You know, they were the kingmakers. And the weekly Kiddush at Sully and Bertha Bornstein's home, in Hallmead, where I lived, where we lived, was something amazing to behold. It was where they held court. Everybody was invited, not everybody came. And it was just an unbelievable experience. And they sort of ruled the roost for that, what I call the rump period. And as I say, the rump period ended, as Meir mentioned, in 1958 when the Bornsteins decided to go back to London. Now there must have been many reasons for the Bornsteins going back to London. I'll tell you one which I mention in the book, which is totally unofficial and maybe absolutely rubbish. I was very friendly. My best friend from when I was born, and she was already 6 months older than me, was Stella Bornstein, Moshe Bornstein's daughter, Stella. We grew up together. We didn't go to school together. She went to a posh little private school. I went to a very nice school, much higher class than where Meir went. No, there was no class consciousness at all in Letchworth. And Stella and I really, we did everything together. I was there every single night of Shabbat at her home. We traipsed through the muddy fields together every Shabbat afternoon to pour future Rabbi Norman Solomon's home for a shiur where we made his life absolutely miserable. Anyway, 1957, within the space of 3 weeks, I hear for the first time there is a place called Communal College. My parents inform me that I'm going to sit an entrance exam to Communal College. I pass the exam, I get a scholarship, the first year that they gave scholarships. I'm meant to start in September. My dad phones Koppel Rosen and he says, look, you've accepted my son. What's he going to do between now and September? Can't he come now to the school? So 2 weeks after the beginning of the summer term, Yaki Fachler arrives in Communal College. Not I was very happy about this. I know that people have traumas about not leaving home, going to a boarding school. Of course, it doesn't apply to Meir. Poor Meir. He'll tell you a story on another evening. But I'm sort of looking forward to this new life, boarding school life, and I was very, very happy to do it. It just fitted my personality. I knew I wasn't being sent away from home because I was a naughty boy. I knew that it's because I got a scholarship. And my parents had this knack of making you proud of just about everything, and so they made me absolutely proud of having got my scholarship. What I didn't realize was the trauma I was leaving behind in Letchworth for poor Stella. Her friend, her lifelong friend, has gone, disappeared, almost without a word. He's off, he's, new life, boarding school life, and she's stuck in Letchworth. One day, during that summer term. She was on the street somewhere and she met a couple of two boys not of the faith, and she was spotted by her father talking to them. And he hit the roof. And she turned around to him and said, "What do you want? Yankee's not here, so who am I going to talk to?" And they left a few months later. Now, is there a causal connection? I leave that for you. All of us, kids, of all ages, once we moved to the Sassoon area, to Somershop, which is after 58, into a house that was 3 times, literally, larger than the Hallmead hovel we had grown up in. And I still can't understand how the half a hovel that my grandparents had, those two, and my mum, and Marion, and you, and then my dad, all in these 2 rooms. I don't know how you did it, but then my dad wanted to get a home for himself, so he went to Abba Bornstein, the guy who owned the 2 homes, and this is end of the war. And he knew that Abba Bornstein was a hard nut to crack because my grandfather had tried and Abba said no. So my dad put on his uniform. Abba was a sucker for Jewish boys in uniform, and he persuaded him, and they moved into their own home, a whole hovel for themselves. It was amazing. And so later we move into this, what would look like a Disney castle for us, just unbelievable. And very, very quickly, we're not just davening at the Sassoons, we are literally, not figuratively, b'nei bayit. I don't think I ever remember knocking on the door, going into the Sassoon house. Now maybe this was very forward of me, but we just went in and out. And it wasn't just for the davening, it was all these visitors that were coming in, who's going to sleep where and who's going to eat where, and lots of arrangements to make. In that period, at different times, all of us, me, my late brother Mordechai, Chaim, Meir, we would be shown some of these absolutely priceless pieces that belonged to the Sassoon Library, which was regarded as probably the biggest and most important private Judaica library in the ganze Welt. And we just, yeah, oh, that's nice, yeah, Rambam, well, all right, fine, yeah, Codex, 1100 years old, sure, yeah, you know. I don't think we fully understood what we were living with. Because it was the Sassoons, and they were us, and because the whole Sassoon experience was so different anyway for us, and we integrated beautifully. Meir will talk about that a bit later. That's it. Tell me when you want more.
So I personally have no memories whatsoever of Hallmead. I was 5 months old when we moved. I was a Somershop kid. My experience is totally around our home and the Sassoon home, which was our shul and our cheder. And even though it's all one Letchworth, for all intents and purposes, I think I lived on another planet compared to where you grew up. One of the things that the book brings out is the extreme level of chesed and hachnasat orchim from the Sassoons and from my parents. And tomorrow night is the 8th yahrzeit of our father, Yaki Fachler's passing. During the shiva of first my dad and then my mum, we had a stream of people visiting us who all claimed to have their lives changed by my parents via their open house, no questions asked, always welcome policy. One of these people, who is a dear friend of the family and who we have stayed in touch with all these years, is a woman who I remember as a young single adult, Louise Ben Oliel Leder, And I would like to ask Louise to share some of her memories of her Letchworth experience. Louise, b'bakasha.
Yeah, when you asked me to say a few words, I thought that it would be in a more familiar kind of surrounding, but I'm humbled to have been asked. And when I talk about Letchworth, I can't but talk about your parents, because that is my relationship with Letchworth. I'd like to share with you one of the many experiences that I had the privilege of living in 37 Sollershot East by this very special family, and this memory that I have shows yet another panel of their unlimited achdasat orchim and loving kindness. If I remember well, there was a Rav from Stamford Hill. His name was Rabbi Duner, and he must have been in contact with your parents, and he expressed the idea that there was a group of youngsters that from Sweden who would come to England, and they hadn't been exposed to Jewish life, so they might come to Letchworth and spend Shabbat there, which your parents readily, obviously, accepted. Well, my friends, that wasn't a Shabbat. It was from Thursday, Friday, Shabbat, Sunday, Monday. And this little group of children was counted about between 20 and 30 children. And then growing, I mean, you had a very nice home, but they were everywhere. I'll recall the Friday night when Mr. Fachler invited them to go and do Netilat Yadayim. They didn't know about Netilat Yadayim, but they went and did. And then everybody came back to that dining room. And then Mr. Fachler came back and said, Motzi, Lechem min haaretz, and in unison, all these youngsters answered Amen, that carried a note of love and affection and thankfulness and gratefulness for where they were. But that wasn't enough. They thought that maybe Louise would like to come and spend Shabbat with them, because they didn't have so many people around. And so they did. But I didn't realize that what was involved, and I accepted. And I went up to your late mother and told her, Mrs. Fachler, maybe I would have come another day. No, it's just fine. So that's one of an example of their generosity and loving kindness. I try to take it with me, and I certainly have formed and impacted with my family, and we should be zoche to remember them for such midot shekaeli. Thank you.
The Swedish camp, yeah, I remember the Swedish camp. It was really something. All of a sudden, these madruchim from Ezra, Sam Khan, Joey Khan, a whole bunch of people came to be the madruchim, and my mother catered the whole thing. That was Abba Duna's doing, this is true. Thank you, Louise. Thank you so much for sharing. So I'm aware that what I considered as normal, for many people who visited us from the outside, and we're talking dozens and dozens of individuals, it was like entering into a fantasy world, totally detached from their normal existence. The smells, the accents, the dialects, the tefillot, the food, the warmth, the beauty, the countryside, the people, and the list goes on. apropos tefillot. The Sassoon home was our shul. And therefore I grew up, for all intents and purposes, as a Baghdadi. I didn't know any different. My davening was full of Baghdadi tunes. For example, Matzilani okay? אז ישיר משה ובני ישראל את השירה הזאת. הלל. We have a request there for Helen. מן המצע קראתיה, ענני במרחביה. עודך כי עניתני, ותהי לי לישועה. עודך כי עניתני, ותהי לי לישועה. אבן מה עשו. Of course, who can forget Simchat Torah? And watching Rabbi Sassoon, like on a pogo stick, jumping up and down, and later, of course, also with Avraham Gabay, singing, Aleph Bet Gimel Daled Ewa, Aleph Bet Gimel Daled Ewa, Aleph Bet Gimel, and the floorboards were like going up and down, like on the sea. It was something which, now, for me, Rabbi Say, was normal. That's what I grew up with. Quite a few of our cousins are here, and all of who had extensive and unforgettable memories of their experiences in Letchworth. Cousin Shim here is one to do very wicked impersonations. I remember when I was in Manchester, I would hear Shimmy's impersonations of people who I'd never met, and then I met them. And I went up to her and said, "You do a very good impersonation of Shimmy." One of the impersonations he would do, after, especially when he'd be with us in Letchworth, was impersonations of the Sassoon's davening. I did not find it funny. For me, it was normal. But I understand that for many, it was in fact quite weird and quite unintelligible. And that is the world we inhabited. People would come in from the outside into this fantasy world to get away from wherever it was, whether it was London or wherever. One crazy memory I have on a weekly learning sessions I had with Rabbi Sassoon, we were learning Mishnah, and just before I came here I found this siddur with an inscription: "To dear Meir Fachler, a souvenir of your siyum of Mishnah Berachot, with best wishes, S.D. Sassoon, Chanukah, Tashkat." So we were learning Mishnah, and at some stage I must have asked a question, and Rabbi Sassoon said, "One sec," and he gets up, he disappears and then reappeared with a large box, and in the box was a cloth. He opened carefully the cloth and took out this very old book. And he told me, "This is the Rambam's Perush on the Mishnah." I thought, all right. I was clueless as to the gravity of the event. But I did ask, "What's all this writing in the margins?" To which he replied, "This is the Perush of his son, Rabbi Avraham ben Harambam." Only years later did I realize that I was in fact learning from the Ktav Yad of the Rambam, and that later the book of the Perush of the Avraham ben Harambam on the Perush and Mishnayot of the Rambam was later published as a separate book based upon that Ktav Yad. So Louise told us about the London Chevra that would visit us. I could add names like Jonathan Schonfeld, we called him John Shon, who I would find sometimes on a Sunday morning in the lounge. The door was not open, so he went through the window. This was not an abnormal thing. Anne Rao, Franz Rosenzweig, Huguette Azoulay, who also married somebody she met at our home, David Wieselberg, Whoopi Bornstein, to name but a few. However, one of the most important characteristics of Letchworth during the middle to late 60s was the Cambridge phenomenon. Pretty much every Shabbat we had Cambridge students over. It changed the whole dynamic. David Greenberg and his brother singing in perfect harmony, all the latest Jewish music, David Rowe, and that University Challenge superstar Roger Kingsley, who is here, and many others. The list is too long to mention all the names, but here, there was a group of the early Cambridge students that included Jonathan Sachs, Elaine Taylor, Frances Landy, and of course, the Gottlieb sisters, Aviva and Frimet. I would like to ask Aviva Zorenberg, Gottlieb, to share some of her memories from that time in Letchworth. Aviva, bevakasha.
Ladies and gentlemen, I look around and see some familiar faces and some strangely half-familiar faces. You can't hear me?
No.
And I'm taken back in time. I think that's the experience tonight. I'm taken back in time to my own innermost life at the beginning of my career. I was in Cambridge in a very non-Jewish environment. I came from a family of intensely Jewish and scholarly preoccupation. My father was a Rav, Avnei Din in Glasgow. And when I was growing up at home, I had a private romance with Judaism. There was something very private about it. It had to do with what we were learning together. We would learn every day. It had to do with the anecdotes of the past, from Poland, from Galicia, from Romania. It had to do with a world that was not this world. It was not the world that we were living in outside. A split world. And my sister and I grew up in this world, impassioned by Judaism. So then I went to Cambridge. And Cambridge, very little trace of Judaism, other than the very active Jewish Student Society. And the very interesting students that I met from many different Jewish societies, Jewish communities. And then there was this strange, as you say, fantasy experience of going for Shabbatot. Suddenly it became the thing to do. To go on the train to Letchworth, which is part of the way to London, and to enter into this, again, other world. And I remember the two families, the two constellations, the Sassoons on the one hand, the Feuchtwangers, and those around them. And on the other hand, the Fachler family. And we would divide our time between the two. On Shabbat, we would walk from one to the other. And my memories have to do with darkness and light. The Sassoon environment, in the best possible sense, is remembered by me in a kind of darkness. The darkness of heavily brocaded walls and carpets, of old books, of extraordinary treasures that I have to say, Meir, I did appreciate. I was very much in awe of what I saw, because my whole inner life was caught up in what I have called the romance of Judaism, of exile and suffering, and the greatness that once was, and the greatness of Torah. I saw things in that light. And here I was meeting in Rabbi Sassoon, I was meeting someone who brought tidings of another ancient world, different from Galicia and Poland, but also saturated with Jewish knowledge and Jewish lore and love, a certain intense Judaism. Of course, Rabbi Sassoon was a very extraordinary person. He himself, I think, was a sort of an energy source. And one of my memories of him is standing on the balls of his feet. He wouldn't put the whole foot down on the ground. He was always just sort of ready to, he was so, somehow a fire was burning in him. And whenever he talked about his researches or showed his books or shared a Dvar Torah, I was totally enraptured. That was, for me, this was just bliss. And then there were the Fachlers, and that was light. That was the light of day. That was life in the modern world. That was Mizrahi, Yaki, which in theory I'd been brought up to regard as a sort of natural home for me, but in practice I hadn't had much experience of it. And suddenly I had this experience of extraordinary wholesomeness and health and energy. These children, one more beautiful and one more vigorous than the other. and the
Go on.
and the extraordinary parents, Ellie and Chava, who I never called that at the time, Mr. and Mrs. Fachler, and who, again, were for me crowned with a kind of romance. I knew they were Holocaust survivors. There was that, and all of that came together with where I came from. And there was a lot of discussion and people coming and going and lots of good food. And for me, that was yet another new experience. It wasn't Cambridge and it wasn't Glasgow. It was something in the intimacy of a small community where the Fachlers were the lodestars. They were the lodestone, that's where people were attracted. A lot of youth, a lot of energy, a lot of hope for the future. Israel was there in there. Now, all these things were things I carried inside me, but in a very private way. And suddenly I see it out there in the light. It's out there in the daylight, and people are living like this. And every now and then I would get a little reminder of what Mr. Fachler had been through, something about history, the difficulties of that history, which brought me back home again to my own parents. But on the whole, there was a feeling of survival with a vengeance. Survival of all that, and a sense of tremendous hope and energy. And that's really all I have to say. I have no anecdotes because I'm very bad at remembering dramatic, piquant stories. It's just something I'm not very good at. But what I remember is a whole atmosphere. It's the aura of a world. And it's a world that came in dark and light. Chiaroscura, I think it's called. When you have a painting that is made of dark and light, the shadows, and they connected for me. And I would say everything afterwards was a further development of that interest of mine, of that passion with the past, and that sense that it could lead to a good future.
Thank you so much, Aviva. I just want to mention that when we moved to Yerushalayim in Ramat Eshkol, so down the road, Aviva was also there. Whenever we overflowed in Ramat Eshkol, we always had where to stay, just on Sheshet Hayamim. So the relationship continued beyond the Letchworth days. One of the last Simcha events that took place in Letchworth was my Bar Mitzvah in February 1971. And the Motzei Shabbat party was for the young people, and it was predominantly made of Cambridge students and the London crowd. They were the chevra that we had. I would like to mention one of the more unique aspects of Letchworth that was a major event for all of the children, and I'm referring to what we called the Shabbos group. Thank you, John. The Shabbos group. This was a peer-run meeting after shul every Shabbat, usually sometimes in one of the rooms in the Sassoon house, but quite often in our sukkah. And the madrichot were the older children. My sister Melanie, Judy Kirsch, Jean Pollock, We sang Jewish songs like Kel Nekomos Hashem, the banana, thank you. Right on cue. And we played games like Dog and Bone and Chinese Whispers. One episode in the book is the Chinese Whispers that started with Moselle Feuchtwanger and ended up with me. And I heard, at the end, mashed potatoes in the larder. And when we asked Moselle what she said at the beginning, it was, Ma nishtana halayla hazeh. I want to mention the others who attended the Shabbos group. The Kirsch children, Judy, Ruth, Daniel, and later, Johnny. The Vangers, Gail and Jonathan. My foster sister, Susie Knight, the Jaffeys, and others, the Pollocks, but they were a little bit older. When the Cambridge students arrived, some of them took on B'nai Akiva or Ezra-type madrich roles with us, especially David Greenberg, who taught us Rabbi Sons and Carlebach melodies and introduced us to the idea of harmonies, something that left a very strong impression on many of us, especially me. Yaki, tell us please what you hoped to achieve by writing this book, other than of course making loads of money. Tell us what it was that you wanted to do by writing the book.
So, the genesis of the book is in 2016. Somehow, the Heritage Society of Letchworth tracked me down to Ireland. I still actually haven't found out how. To ask me some questions about the Sassoon Library. The library that David Sassoon Sr. had put together, which of course the Codex Sassoon was part of. Philippa Parker was the lady who I was in contact with. I sent her some information, which she was happy with. And toch kedei dibur, we agreed that I would come to Letchworth and give a talk to the Letchworth Garden City Society about the Jews of Letchworth, focusing, of course, mainly on the war years. Why? Because they knew nothing. There was no communal memory. Now, I mentioned earlier there was no physical footprint, but even the people in charge of the heritage knew absolutely nothing. So they wanted me to come, and I came and I gave them a talk. And there are probably some people here this evening from the Jewish Historical Society of England, the English-speaking Israel branch, to whom I have spoken many times over the last few years. And Kenneth would ask me every so often, so what do you want to talk about on your next visit to Israel? And I would give him a list. And so, same happened, 2016. And at the last minute, as about to press send, I thought, I'll put in the Letchworth title, as well as the other ones. And to my surprise, Kenneth comes back to me and says, we want the Letchworth talk, please. So in fact, I ended up giving the Letchworth talk in Jerusalem before I gave the Letchworth talk in Letchworth. And in both places, I sort of broke records. I still think, I got a lovely email from people in Letchworth saying that they believe that I contravened every safety law, bylaw in the place. And my son Amiti accompanied me to that talk in Letchworth. This was already for me a sort of, there's interest here, certainly in Letchworth and in Jerusalem, about Letchworth. Something which I maybe hadn't totally realized. I did know that in the past 12 years or so, there had been at least a couple of attempts to write the Letchworth book. But I also knew that those attempts just didn't work out. Fast forward a couple of years, 2021. This is the height of the COVID, everyone is stuck at home. And I called them the Letchworth girls, Carol and that's right, Carol and Jean and a few others, and you. Yeah, and Gail. Came up with the idea, we're all stuck anyway, let's do a worldwide Letchworth Zoom evening. Yaki, will you please give the introduction? And let's just see what happens. First of all, the number of people that turned up to that Zoom astounded everybody. And the things we heard astounded everybody. And the enthusiasm and the warmth and everyone had something to say, and everyone was talking about je ne sais quoi, something special that connected them with Letchworth, whether they'd only been once in their lives or whether they were there every day of their life. I listened, didn't actually participate much after my introductory talk. I listened. By the end of the evening, by the end of the Zoom evening, I decided, well, actually it's like this. I heard a voice say, okay, I'm going to write the book. And then I realized it was me who'd said it. Now, why? What prompted me to decide to write the book? So first of all, I'm a writer. So writing books for me is not something that I face with trepidation. I sensed the enthusiasm and the excitement, and I realized while we were on Zoom, and I'm not saying this to blow my own trumpet, but I realized that if I did not take on this task of writing a book about the Letchworth Kehillah, about the Letchworth Jewish community, nobody ever would. Thank you. And so I made that decision that I would write the book, and I immediately knew exactly what I wanted, how I wanted it, what it was going to look like. You know, if you're a writer, you know these things. I could see the chapter headings. Couldn't yet see the front cover, that took a little longer. I started writing and received an avalanche of material, including from people here this evening, heartwarming and special, and adding information that I didn't know, and from people who I didn't know. Last night I was doing something similar with another Fachler brother called Chaim, and we were in Netanya, and there too we had a bumper crowd, and it was great. And Chaim's last question to me was, what did you think you were going to achieve when you wrote the book? And do you think you've achieved it? Which I thought was a very intelligent question for Chaim.
That's the next question, Meir.
So I've told you why. I've told you why I believed I had to do it. It wasn't just, oh no. It was, I have to write this book. I knew I had to write this book because I knew there was something missing. The feedback that I have received since the book has come out has proved to me that there was something missing, and that people now look at it and there's almost, I hear from many of the readers, a sigh of relief. Ah! Sof sof! At last, here is something tangible. Here is the footprint that Letchworth never had. There's a book now. In Letchworth itself, they tell me that I have filled a gap in local history that nobody else could have done, because no one's got either the information or the inclination. And in the wider Jewish community, historians and others have told me that I filled a gap in Anglo-Jewish history. So I have to admit that what I set out to do, I'd like to believe that I achieved, because the feedback from so many different people, from so many different backgrounds, has been, this is Letchworth. This is the Letchworth that I remember, or it's the Letchworth my parents didn't stop talking about, or my friends never stopped talking about. So, yeah, I'm very happy I did it. I'm very happy that I found a publisher. I found a publisher, but I had to do most of the work myself because the publisher doesn't have any outlet here in Israel. I said, what do I do? He says, take them in your case. So I did. That's the books that sold out last night and probably sold out here as well.
Yeah, they do.
Oh, sold out. There we go. It is available from Valentine Mitchell. It is available from Amazon. And if you couldn't get them now, then by all means.
Soon to be made into a major motion picture.
So, I want to thank you. I want to thank you because so many of you contributed. So many of you made me realize that the decision to write the book was a good one, because I got such wonderful stories and anecdotes and things I had never heard of and wouldn't have known. Thank you for coming this evening for this jamboree of Letchworth Memory Lane, Solashop East Lane maybe. And Bemet, thank you all very much.
So, as I mentioned, tomorrow night is Dad's yahrzeit, and I obviously, listening to all of these stories about Letchworth and especially about David Sassoon's parents and my parents, this has been an incredible hilula for that generation. So many of us here owe so much to these people, and I think it is very fitting, the timing of this particular event that we're doing, to fall exactly today, which is tomorrow night is Dad's yahrzeit. And I'm sure they are quelling, Yaki, from all the work that you have done. We have maybe 2 or 3 minutes. If there are any questions, not speeches, please. Any questions that anybody wants to ask that we might be able to answer? Yes.
It's been a tremendous privilege actually to be here. When you said, Yankee, I'm addressing him rather than yourself, Mayor.
Try and speak up.
I just wondered, with all the avalanche of information that you got, did many of the Gentiles, or the Goyim, if you want to call them that, who must have had some interaction with the Jewish community, did they have any recollections that they brought forward?
Not many. Sorry, the question was, as I was gathering information for the book, was there any feedback from the Gentile population of Letchworth? Because there must have been, as you say, interaction. So the truth is that there wasn't a huge amount of interaction. Maybe people who had businesses, yes, but Holmead and Malware was a ghetto. It was a self-contained ghetto. You didn't need a passport to get in or out. But it was a Jewish enclave, and so the only place you met non-Jews, apart from when you went to the shops, was school. And I haven't spoken about the schools, but there's a chapter on the schools. And the chapter on the schools is not necessarily the happiest chapter in the book, because it is the chapter where many people of different ages from all three of the periods we've spoken about talk about anti-Semitism at school. I never had an anti-Semitic remark ever in my years in Wilbury School up to the age of 11. Of course, after that I was at boarding school. But many people did, even in Wilbury. And of course, if you're a kid and you hear anti-Semitic remarks, that tars you. You remember that for life, and that's not easy. So that's one area of interaction. When I gave my first talk in Letchworth, 2017, a guy comes up to me. Amiti remembers this.
Ridicule.
What did he say?
Ridicule. Can you talk about the ridicule?
That's right. A guy comes up to me and he takes the mic at the end of the evening and he sort of gingerly tries to say that if there were any remarks out of order, as he said, ridicule, he's apologizing. I didn't know what he was talking about at first. It's Amiti who understood what the guy was actually saying. He was saying sorry if there were. So it's a funny thing that I made a calculation that in the war there was 16,000 population of Letchworth. It grew to 30,000 and it stayed. It's quite deliberate. It's not an accident that it stayed at 30. And I think that at the height, in my calculation, the Jewish community in Letchworth before the end of the war could have reached as high as 1,500, which means 10% of the Letchworth community was Jewish, but there was relatively little. I've quoted a few non-Jewish people in the book, but most of them I have got my information from public sources. Only one person I actually asked, my best friend when I was a kid, and he said, I didn't know anybody, I didn't know any Jews apart from your family. So he doesn't feel that he's got something to say about the wider Jewish community.
Yaki, can you tell the story about the groups that came up from London to see the Jews of Letchworth? You mentioned this yesterday.
This is very, very short. The question was, never mind the question, I'll tell you the story. People have asked me, how were the Jews who arrived in masses, 1939, 1940, how were they received? You know, like all of a sudden we've got an influx. Now, of course, there were other influxes. This was the mass evacuation, this was the Pied Piper, this was kids arriving alone, this was schools arriving. I discovered, first of all, if you really want to know what people thought about Letchworth, look up Letchworth and George Orwell. Look up Letchworth and George Bernard Shaw, and you will find the most terrible things that they say. I mean, the most biting, sarcastic, ironic things about Letchworth. I do know for a fact that in the 1930s, the Daily Mail ran bus tours from London to Letchworth to come and look at the queer folk in Letchworth. This is true. I've checked it out. I've seen actually advertisements. My theory is one group of weird folk welcoming another group of weird folk. No big deal.
So we're coming to the end of this amazing evening. A couple of things I'd like to say. We just haven't got time, I'm sorry. So there's a few books for sale. I think all the Letchworth books have been sold out. There are The Vow.
The Vow.
The Vow, which is my parents' memoirs, which Yaki edited, is also there for sale, as is The Legacy, which Yaki wrote of all the people who wrote stuff about my parents after they passed away. So that's also outside if you want to purchase. There's also, I'm reminding everybody, there is a 20 shekel minimal suggested donation to help us with the expenses we had here this evening. I'd like to conclude on a personal note, which is I feel very much a product. The first 13 years of my life, I feel I'm a product of this phenomenon called Letchworth. And I feel blessed that to call myself a product of Letchworth. And there was something quite unique about living in this rural England, going to Westbury JMI and then Hitchin Boys Grammar School, winning the debating cup in the school, the only Jewish kid in the school with a kippah and tzitzit, and also played rugby for the school before I came here to Israel for high school. And I think I'm probably talking about everybody of this generation, Gail and Ruth and Johnny, whoever's here, that we were blessed because we were given such a solid anchor of proud, open Judaism, living it as normal as can be, even though we were living in this totally non-Jewish environment, and it wasn't a conflict. I remember my parents asked me when I went for my first day to school, do I want to wear a kippah? And I looked at her saying, what kind of a question is that? I said, well, we also asked Yaki, and Yaki said, of course, I'm going to wear a kippah. And it was the strangest, for me, it was the strangest question. It was like, of course, because we live in Letchworth. And we go up the road to the Sassoons and we have Shabbat and everything like that, and then we go to school, but it's all integrated. And I feel that I've taken that with me, and every time I talk to my contemporaries, we all carry the same Jewish pride with the ability to be able to be in so many different environments without it shaking any of our beliefs or customs. It's just natural. So that, for me, I want to say, is one of the things that I've taken away from this. And of course, once you can take a kid out of Letchworth, and these things, so much, every so often, I'm reminded of all kinds of things. It's just part of our DNA, all of us who went through it. And I would like to give the last word. Before I give the last word to Yaki, I want to wish him success onwards, and to thank him for this amazing book that he's done, and thank you all for coming.
So, as I'm writing the book, collecting the material, I got 3 thoughts that are hovering in my consciousness. One of them is, you just alluded to it, you can take the boy out of Letchworth, but you can't take Letchworth out of the boy. And to this day, wherever I am in the world and someone says, where are you from? I say, I'm from Letchworth. If they want to know more, that's Paris, Russia. But I am from Letchworth. I don't say what country, I'm from Letchworth. You want to know more, I'll tell you. I am a Letchworth boy. The other one hovering in my mind is, it takes a village to raise a child. And in Letchworth, I really believe that those of us privileged to be raised in Letchworth, we were raised by an incredible village. And the last one, again, very much in my mind, Anachnu mioto hakfar. There was something in Letchworth about we are all from the same, we're made of the same something that Letchworth was unique for. Bless you, thank you very much.
There will be an additional Meir in short.